The light on the old porch hadn't been turned off in 26 years in the small town of Oak Ridge, Mississippi, where the cicadas sing louder than traffic and everyone knows not just your name, but your grandparents' names too. Martha Wilson's murder remained an open wound that refused to heal. A beloved grandmother, church organist, and the unofficial historian of Oak Ridge, 62-year-old Martha, disappeared on a humid evening in June 1995, leaving behind a family fractured by grief and a community haunted by unanswered questions. "My mother left to pick up butter for her famous peach cobbler," recalls Susan Wilson, Martha's daughter, her eyes still glistening with tears even after all these years. She was making it for the church potluck the next day. That was the last time any of us saw her alive. Martha's blue 1989 Oldsmobile Cutlass was found abandoned 2 days later at Cypress Creek, a secluded fishing spot 5 miles outside of town. The keys were still in the ignition. Her purse sat untouched on the passenger seat, but Martha was nowhere to be found. The initial search was massive by local standards. Volunteer firefighters waded through the murky waters of Cypress Creek. The high school football team combed through the surrounding woods. Sheriff Dale Montgomery, new to his position at the time, coordinated with neighboring counties to bring in cadaver dogs. Local news stations from Jackson drove down to cover the story, their vans an unusual sight on Oak Ridge's quiet streets. This town came together like never before, remembers Reverend Thomas Hamilton, who led prayers at the First Baptist Church, where Martha had played organ for over 30 years. "We had search parties going out at dawn and not coming back until it was too dark to see. People brought food to the Wilson family for weeks. Everyone loved Martha." But despite the community's efforts, weeks passed with no sign of Martha. Summer heat gave way to fall chill, and the search parties grew smaller. The news vans left. Life in Oak Ridge reluctantly returned to its normal rhythm, except for the Wilsons. "My daddy never gave up," Susan says. "He kept her case file in our dining room. Every night after dinner, he'd open it up and go through everything again, looking for something everyone missed." Robert Wilson, Martha's husband of 40 years, became a familiar sight around town, pinning up fresh missing person posters whenever the old ones faded. He'd stop people on the street to ask if they remembered anything at all, from that June evening. Many would later recall how his once robust frame seemed to shrink with each passing month. Then, on a crisp October morning in 1995, almost 4 months after Martha's disappearance, local hunter Sam Jessup made a grim discovery while tracking deer in the dense woods beyond Patterson's farm, nearly 15 miles from where Martha's car had been found. "I saw a patch of blue fabric that didn't belong there," Jessup stated in his police report. "When I got closer, I knew right away I'd found her. I'd seen her picture so many times on those posters all over town." Martha Wilson's body had been covered with branches and forest debris, a hasty attempt at concealment. The autopsy would later confirm what everyone feared. She had been strangled with a length of rope that was still knotted around her neck. The blue fabric was from her church dress, the one she often wore when practicing organ on weekday evenings. Sheriff Montgomery's investigation focused initially on the obvious: robbery gone wrong, random violence, or even a crime of passion. But Martha's life yielded no obvious suspects. Her purse had been left untouched in her car, with $43 still in her wallet. She had no known enemies. By all accounts, she was universally loved, the kind of woman who remembered everyone's birthdays and kept casseroles in her freezer to deliver whenever illness or hardship struck a neighbor. The investigation stalled. Witnesses were re-interviewed. Evidence was sent to the state crime lab in Jackson. A timeline was established and revised, then revised again. Nothing led to a viable suspect. "We were looking at this all wrong," admits Montgomery, now retired. "We were looking for someone who hated Martha, or at least had a reason to hurt her. But in small towns like ours, evil sometimes wears a friendly face." Robert Wilson died in 2008, his heart finally giving out after 13 years of grief and obsession. In his desk drawer, Susan found a journal where he'd written down every lead, every rumor, every theory about his wife's murder. The last entry, dated just 3 days before his death, read simply, "Someone in this town knows. Someone in this town knows, and they're still walking free." Susan kept the porch light burning at her parents' old house, just as her father had done every night since Martha disappeared. "Daddy always said it was to light Mom's way home," Susan explains. "After he died, I kept it on for both of them. For 26 years that light burned. For 26 years, Martha Wilson's murder remained unsolved. The case file grew thin and yellow with age. Newer, fresher tragedies demanded the attention of Oak Ridge's small police force. The town's collective memory began to fade. But in the winter of 2021, everything would change with a single phone call to the Oak Ridge Police Department, and the small Mississippi town would soon discover that the killer had been hiding in plain sight all along, behind a mask of respectability that no one thought to question. Sometimes justice sleeps, but it never dies. By January 2021, Martha Wilson's murder had become something akin to local folklore in Oak Ridge, a tragedy from another time, a cautionary tale parents told teenagers about being careful after dark. The newer residents of town knew Martha only from the faded photograph that still hung in the First Baptist Church Fellowship Hall, her gentle smile frozen in time beneath a plaque reading, "In loving memory, 1933-1995. For Detective Leanne Carter, however, Martha Wilson was about to become much more than a fading memory. "I grew up hearing about the Wilson case," explains Carter, who joined the Oak Ridge Police Department in 2018 after 8 years with the Jackson PD. "My mom was in Martha's Sunday school class. When Chief Parker assigned me to the cold case unit, which in Oak Ridge means me working overtime in a storage closet, I knew exactly which box I wanted to pull first." The cold case unit was Chief Robert Parker's pet project, created after a state grant provided funding for small-town police departments to revisit unsolved murders. In Oak Ridge, that meant precisely 3 cases, with Martha Wilson's being the most infamous. "The file was surprisingly thorough," Carter notes. "Sheriff Montgomery might not have had today's technology, but he knew how to run an investigation. Every interview was meticulously documented. Every lead followed up. Every piece of evidence catalogued. Among that evidence was a length of nylon rope, the murder weapon still coiled around Martha Wilson's neck when her body was discovered. It had been carefully preserved in the evidence lockup for over 2 decades, along with soil samples from beneath the body, fibers from Martha's clothing, and a partial shoe print found near the scene. "What caught my attention was the rope," Carter says. "It was a very specific type of braided nylon, bright yellow, the kind used for water skiing. Montgomery had noted that it seemed new, barely used, but no one could trace where it came from. Back then, they checked the local hardware stores, but there was no way to track purchases like we can today. Carter's first step was to send the preserved evidence to the state crime lab for modern DNA analysis, something that hadn't been available to the original investigation team in 1995. "We weren't expecting much," admits Chief Parker. "Evidence degrades over time, especially in our climate, but Leanne insisted, and I've learned not to underestimate her persistence." While waiting for results, Carter immersed herself in Martha Wilson's life. She interviewed surviving friends and family, including Susan Wilson, now in her 60s herself. She pored over Robert Wilson's journal, tracking his increasingly desperate theories. She created a massive timeline on the wall of her makeshift office, mapping out Martha's last known movements. One name kept appearing in the periphery of the case, Carter explains. Someone who was interviewed multiple times, but always as a witness, never as a suspect. Someone who found reasons to insert himself into the investigation repeatedly. Someone who organized search parties that, in retrospect, never came anywhere close to where the body was actually found. That name was Gerald Atkins, now 78 years old. In 1995, Atkins had been the vice principal at Oak Ridge High School, a deacon at First Baptist Church, and a respected figure in the community. He had also been one of the last people to see Martha alive, having reported running into her at Jensen's Market where she'd gone to buy butter. I went back to his original statements, Carter says. Each time he was interviewed, he added new details, embellishing his story. That's actually a red flag in investigations. Truthful witnesses tend to tell the same story consistently, while deceptive ones elaborate over time. But it wasn't Atkins's inconsistent statements that finally broke the case open. It was a phone call from the State Crime Lab in February 2021. They found DNA, Carter recalls, her voice still carrying a note of disbelief. After all these years, they found trace DNA on the rope that didn't belong to Martha. It was degraded, but the advances in forensic technology made it possible to extract a usable profile. That DNA profile was entered into the national database, but no match came back. The killer's DNA wasn't in the system. That's when I decided to try genetic genealogy, says Carter. It's a technique that solved dozens of cold cases across the country in recent years. Instead of looking for an exact match, we look for distant relatives who share DNA similarities, then build family trees until we find our suspect. The process was painstaking, but within weeks, the analysis pointed to the Atkins family tree. Gerald Atkins had never been arrested, had never had his DNA entered into any criminal database, but his second cousin had submitted DNA to a genealogy website, creating the thread that investigators could follow. We needed his DNA to confirm, Carter explains. We couldn't just knock on his door and ask for it, so we conducted surveillance. Atkins was still living in Oak Ridge, still respected, though retired now. We watched him eat at the local diner, then collected his fork. We retrieved a discarded coffee cup. We built our case methodically. When the DNA comparison came back as a match, Carter and Chief Parker faced a momentous decision: how to arrest a man who, for many in Oak Ridge, represented the moral fiber of their community. We did it by the book, Chief Parker states firmly. No special treatment, no courtesy calls. We had a warrant and we served it like we would for anyone else. On the morning of March 15th, 2021, Gerald Atkins was arrested at his home on Magnolia Street, just 3 blocks from the church where Martha Wilson had played organ. Neighbors watched in stunned silence as the elderly man, still in his bathrobe, was led to a police cruiser. News of the arrest spread through Oak Ridge with the speed that only small-town gossip can achieve. By noon, crowds had gathered outside the police station. Former students of Atkins stood shoulder to shoulder with members of Martha's church choir. Disbelief hung in the air like the Mississippi humidity. My first thought was they'd made a terrible mistake, admits Reverend James Collins, the current pastor of First Baptist. Gerald Atkins, the man who led our youth group for decades, who organized our annual charity drive. It couldn't be possible. But as details emerged during Atkins' initial hearing, the impossible became increasingly difficult to deny. The DNA evidence, the rope traced to a sporting goods store where Atkins had an account, and most damning of all, a hidden key to a storage unit in Meridian, 40 miles away, where police found newspaper clippings about Martha's murder meticulously preserved in plastic sleeves, a killer's macabre scrapbook. The hardest part wasn't finding evidence once we knew where to look, Carter says. It was accepting that evil had been hiding in plain sight in our town for 26 years, that the man who helped search for Martha knew exactly where she was all along, that he attended her memorial service, comforted her husband, and all the while kept his terrible secret. As Atkins was led away to await trial, Susan Wilson stood on the courthouse steps, her father's journal clutched to her chest. The porch light that had burned for 26 years would finally be switched off, but the darkest secrets of Oak Ridge were only beginning to come to light. The Yazoo County Courthouse stands like a weathered sentinel in the heart of Oak Ridge, its red brick facade and white columns having witnessed generations of Mississippi justice. On the morning of September 12, 2021, those columns could barely be seen behind the crowds that gathered for the first day of Gerald Atkins' trial. "I've never seen anything like it," says court clerk Marjorie Blackwell, who has worked in the courthouse for over 30 years. People were lining up at 4 in the morning to get a seat. We had to set up speakers outside so folks could hear the proceedings. It was like the whole town needed to be there, needed to understand how this could happen. Inside the packed courtroom, District Attorney William Hayes laid out the prosecution's case with methodical precision. The DNA evidence on the rope, the matching soil samples from Atkins' hunting boots preserved in his garage for decades, the storage locker filled with newspaper clippings, and a new piece of evidence, Martha's missing church pin, a small gold cross engraved with her initials, found hidden in a hollow Bible on Atkins's bookshelf. But it was the motive that the town of Oakridge struggled most to comprehend. The defendant, Gerald Atkins, maintained a facade of respectability for decades, Hayes told the jury in his opening statement. But beneath that mask was a man consumed by rejection and rage. 26 years ago, he made romantic advances toward Martha Wilson, advances she firmly rejected out of respect for her marriage and her faith. That rejection cost Martha Wilson her life. The revelation sent ripples of shocked whispers through the courtroom. Gerald Atkins, 30 years a deacon, beloved vice principal, founder of the town's youth mentorship program, harboring such darkness behind his community-minded exterior. It shouldn't have been shocking, reflects Detective Carter. So many violent crimes against women stem from this exact scenario. A man who can't handle rejection, who feels entitled to a woman's attention. But because Atkins had cultivated this sterling reputation, people couldn't reconcile the public man with the private monster. Atkins' defense team, led by attorney James Buchanan from Jackson, attempted to challenge the DNA evidence, suggesting contamination after decades in storage. They questioned the timeline, pointing out inconsistencies in witness statements from 1995. But their arguments seemed to falter against the mountain of physical evidence and the damning contents of Atkins' storage locker. As the trial progressed, more disturbing details emerged. Former female students tentatively came forward with stories of uncomfortable interactions with Atkins during his tenure as vice principal. Nothing that had risen to the level of formal complaints, but a pattern of boundary crossing that now appeared in a sinister new light. He would comment on what I was wearing, shared Amanda Reeves, Oakridge High class of 1992, who testified during the trial's second week. He'd find reasons to be alone with certain girls in his office. We all just thought he was being nice, taking an interest. Now I wonder how many of us had narrow escapes. On the trial's fifth day, the prosecution called Susan Wilson to the stand. Now the same age her mother was when she was murdered, Susan spoke with quiet dignity about the decades of grief, her father's obsessive search for answers, and the porch light that had burned as a symbol of their unending hope for resolution. "Did your mother ever mention Gerald Atkins to you?" Hayes asked her. "Yes," Susan replied, her voice steady. "About 2 weeks before she disappeared, she mentioned that Mr. Atkins had been acting strangely at church, finding reasons to sit next to her during committee meetings, offering to drive her home from choir practice. She laughed it off, said he was probably just being neighborly, but she also said something I'll never forget. Some men don't seem to remember that no is a complete sentence." Perhaps the most chilling testimony came from Ralph Jenkins, former groundskeeper at First Baptist, now in his 90s, and testifying via video from his nursing home. Jenkins recalled seeing Atkins' green pickup truck parked near the church late on the evening Martha disappeared. "I didn't think nothing of it at the time," Jenkins testified. "Mr. Atkins was always coming and going for church business, but he was sitting there in the parking lot like he was waiting for someone." Throughout the proceedings, Atkins himself remained stoic, almost statue-like at the defense table. The once commanding presence now appeared diminished in his orange jumpsuit, his shoulders hunched, his gaze fixed on some middle distance that no one else could see. It took the jury just 4 hours to reach their verdict. "We, the jury, find the defendant, Gerald Atkins, guilty of murder in the first degree." The courtroom erupted, not in cheers, but in a collective exhalation, as if the town of Oak Ridge had been holding its breath for 26 years and could finally release it. Susan Wilson closed her eyes, her lips moving in what appeared to be a silent prayer. Detective Carter placed a steadying hand on her shoulder. At his sentencing hearing 1 week later, Atkins finally broke his silence. Rising shakily to his feet when asked if he had any statement to make, he turned not toward the judge, but toward the gallery where Susan Wilson sat. "She should have said yes," he stated, his voice eerily calm. "All these years, all this pain, because she couldn't say yes." Judge Eleanor Hawkins sentenced Gerald Atkins to life without the possibility of parole, the maximum penalty allowed under Mississippi law. At 78 years old, Atkins would spend his remaining days at the Mississippi State Penitentiary at Parchman. "No sentence can restore what was taken from the Wilson family," Judge Hawkins stated. "No punishment can adequately address the magnitude of this betrayal, not just of Martha Wilson, but of an entire community that trusted you." Indeed, as Atkins was led from the courtroom, the ripple effects of his crimes were still spreading through Oak Ridge. The church board convened emergency meetings to review all of Atkins' interactions with youth groups over his decades of service. The school district opened an investigation into his tenure as vice principal. And in living rooms across town, difficult conversations took place about warning signs missed, uncomfortable moments dismissed, and the danger of elevating community figures beyond scrutiny. "This case changed Oak Ridge forever," Chief Parker reflects, "not just because we finally solved our most notorious murder, but because it forced us to reckon with some uncomfortable truths. We trusted too easily. We dismissed women's concerns too readily. We allowed a man's position to shield him from suspicion." For Susan Wilson, the conviction brought complex emotions rather than simple closure. "Justice is a funny word," she says, standing on the porch of her childhood home, where the light has finally been turned off. "It doesn't bring Mom back. It doesn't give Dad the peace he deserved before he died, but it does mean that the truth is finally acknowledged. That matters." In the aftermath of the trial, Martha Wilson's legacy has been reclaimed by the community. The First Baptist Church established a music scholarship in her name. The high school planted a memorial garden where students can reflect on both the tragedy and the long arc of justice that finally brought her killer to account. And in the Oak Ridge Police Department, Detective Leanne Carter has turned her attention to the 2 remaining cold cases in her closet-sized office. What the Martha Wilson case taught us is that time doesn't erase evidence. It just changes how we need to look at it, Carter says. Every victim deserves what Martha finally received. Every family deserves answers, no matter how long it takes. As for Gerald Atkins, he remains a cautionary tale about the darkness that can hide behind the most respectable facades, and about the persistence of truth waiting to be uncovered, no matter how deeply buried. "Mom always told me that secrets don't stay buried in small towns," Susan Wilson says, a hint of her mother's smile finally returning to her face. "She was right about that. She was right about a lot of things. The porch light at the Wilson house may be off now, but across Oak Ridge, other lights have been ignited. The light of vigilance, of questioning, of refusing to let position and power shield the guilty from consequences. And perhaps most importantly, the light of remembrance for a beloved grandmother whose life was cut short, but whose legacy continues to illuminate the path toward justice in a small Mississippi town that will never forget her name."